Picture this, a cold winter's night in a medieval village where the only light comes from a crackling fire. The air is thick with the smell of burning wood and the faint scent of stew simmering nearby. Every face in the room is turned toward one person, the storyteller. Their voice rises and falls, weaving tales of brave knights, tragic love, and faraway lands. But this isn't just entertainment. In that moment, stories are the threads stitching the community together, passing down wisdom, shaping identities, and keeping history alive. This was the power of storytelling in the Middle Ages, a force so profound it didn't just reflect culture, it built it. Think about the last time you got lost in a great story, maybe a book, a film, or even a song that gave you chills. Now imagine living in a world where those stories weren't just distractions, but the very fabric of daily life. In medieval Europe, ballads and tales were more than art. They were how people understood their past, their values, and their place in the world. Wandering minstrels carried news like living newspapers. Epic poems like Beowulf taught lessons about courage and loyalty. And even simple reinforced the bonds between neighbors. These stories weren't just told, they were lived, shaping everything from political alliances to personal beliefs. So why does this matter to us today? Because the stories we tell still hold that same power. The medieval world reminds us that narratives aren't just about escapism, they're about survival. They help us make sense of chaos, find common ground, and remember who we are. Over the next minutes, we'll travel back to a time when every song had a purpose, every tale a lesson, and discover how these ancient traditions still echo in the stories we love now. From the firelit halls of lords to the humblest peasant cottages, prepare to see history and storytelling in a whole new light. In a world without printing presses or widespread literacy, memory was the library, and the human voice was the only way to preserve knowledge. Imagine a village elder recounting the same heroic saga their own grandparents had told them, each retelling adding new layers, adapting to the times, yet keeping the core truths alive. This was the heartbeat of medieval society, where oral tradition didn't just record history, it breathed life into it. Storytellers and bards weren't mere entertainers. They were historians, teachers, and even mediators, their words carrying the weight of law and tradition. Take the Icelandic sagas, for example, epic tales of Vikings and settlers passed down for centuries before being written. These stories weren't just thrilling adventures, they were legal records, tracing land claims and family lineages with precision. A single skald, a Norse poet, could recite genealogies stretching back generations, settling disputes with nothing but the power of memory. Or consider the troubadours of southern France, whose romantic ballads didn't just celebrate chivalry, but subtly shaped the behavior of knights and nobles, turning ideals of honor into social expectations. But oral tradition wasn't rigid. Like a river, it changed course to nourish the communities it flowed through. A tale told in one village might emphasize humility, while the same story, miles away, might highlight bravery, tailored to the values each place needed most. Even the famous Canterbury Tales began as oral stories, with pilgrims swapping narratives that reflected their world's humor, flaws, and wisdom. This adaptability made oral tradition more than a relic of the past. It was a living dialogue between generations, constantly rewriting itself to meet the present. What's striking is how these traditions blurred the line between fact and fiction. A ballad about a local hero might mix real events with mythical embellishments, not to deceive, but to distill deeper truths. When a community heard how Sir Gawain faced the Green Knight, they weren't just hearing a fantasy. They were learning about integrity, courage, and the cost of promises. In a time before science could explain storms or sickness, stories gave meaning to the unexplainable, turning fear into folklore and chaos into order. And let's not forget the rhythm of it all, the way meter and rhyme made tales unforgettable. Medieval bards didn't just speak their stories, they sang, chanted, and performed them, turning words into experiences. The repetitive refrains of ballads like Barbara or the Trois Sisters weren't just artistic flourishes. They were memory aids, ensuring even children could carry these lessons forward. In an age where few could read, melody was the glue that held culture together. So the next time you hum a catchy tune or retell a family story, you're tapping into something ancient. The medieval world understood what we sometimes forget, that stories aren't just told. They're inherited, reshaped, and entrusted to the next generation. In a way, those long-ago storytellers still speak through us, proving that the most powerful technology isn't the printing press or the internet. It's the human voice, passing the torch in the dark. The minstrel's arrival in a medieval village was an event, a burst of color in a world of routine. Dressed in vibrant fabrics, their lute slung across their back, they carried more than instruments. They were walking archives of human experience. Unlike nobles bound to their lands or peasants tied to the soil, minstrels moved freely, slipping through the cracks of a fractured society. A song performed in a northern castle might find new life weeks later in a southern market square, subtly shifting to reflect local dialects or concerns. This wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural oxygen, circulating ideas between places that might never otherwise connect. Consider the sheer range of roles a single minstrel might play. In a lord's hall, they could perform chivalric romances, reinforcing the ideals of knighthood with tales of Lancelot or Tristan. The next evening, in a bustling alehouse, that same performer might switch to raucous drinking songs full of sly humor about greedy priests or foolish husbands, stories that gave the common folk a rare chance to laugh at the powerful. Minstrels were cultural chameleons, code-switching between audiences while secretly weaving a shared tapestry of values. Their art thrived on duality, celebrating authority in one breath and subtly challenging it in the next. Music was their secret weapon. A ballad about a recent battle might spread news faster than any courier, but the melody made it stick. Tunes traveled farther than words alone, lodging in memories and inviting audiences to join in on refrains. This interactivity turned passive listeners into participants, blurring the line between performer and crowd. When a minstrel sang of Robin Hood, the room didn't just hear about justice. They felt it, shouting along to choruses that turned a folk hero into a collective aspiration. The best minstrels didn't just perform stories, they orchestrated communal catharsis. Their influence reached beyond mere amusement. In an age before mass media, minstrels were the closest thing to journalists, translating complex events into digestible narratives. A crusade's outcome, a king's marriage, even a distant famine, all were filtered through their artistry, shaping public perception. Chroniclers often dismissed them as frivolous, but rulers knew better. Many employed court minstrels as propagandists, their songs crafting flattering myths around royal power. Yet the streets had their own counter-narratives. A biting satire sung in a tavern could undermine official news, proving that even in a hierarchical world, storytelling was a. What's most remarkable is how minstrels transcended social barriers. At a time when nobility and peasantry lived parallel lives, these performers moved fluidly between worlds. A lord might pay them in silver for an evening's diversion, while farmers rewarded them with bread and shelter. This unique position made them invisible mediators, carrying the worries of the poor to the ears of the powerful, and vice versa, disguised as entertainment. When a minstrel sang of a starving village, it wasn't just a lament. It was a diplomatic message, delivered with strings instead of seals. The legacy of minstrels lingers in unexpected places. Today's traveling musicians, protest singers, even podcasters echoing stories across digital networks, they all walk in the footsteps of those medieval wanderers. The tools have changed, but the essence remains. Stories move where people cannot, bending borders and building bridges. Long after the last medieval minstrel vanished, their truth endures, that a song can be a compass, a weapon, or a handshake, depending on who's listening and how it's sung. Ballads were the medieval world's way of turning history into heartbeat, a living, breathing record that pulsed through taverns and town squares long before ink touched parchment. While monks meticulously chronicled events in Latin manuscripts, ballads did something far more radical. They put history into the mouths of ordinary people. A farmer tilling fields might never read a chronicle, but they could sing every verse of the battle of, reliving the clash between English and Scottish forces as if they'd stood on that bloody moor themselves. These songs weren't just about remembering, they were about feeling. When a ballad described the weight of a knight's sword or the desperation of a besieged town, listeners didn't just learn what happened, they experienced it. Take the Ballad of Chevy Chase, which immortalized a brutal skirmish between English and Scottish border lords. Official records might note the date and casualties, but the ballad captures the grit, the way arrows fell like hail, how men fought till their hands were red. It's raw, immediate, and unflinching, turning dry facts into visceral memory. This was history without filters, where the emotional stakes mattered as much as the outcomes. And because ballads traveled orally, they evolved with each telling, absorbing local perspectives. A version sung in York might paint the English as heroes, while Edinburgh's rendition celebrated Scottish resilience. These weren't contradictions. They were proof that history is never one story, but many. Robin Hood's ballads took this even further, transforming outlaw tales into a kind of folk justice. While court scribes dismissed him as a criminal, the songs celebrated him as a champion of the poor, stealing from corrupt sheriffs to feed the hungry. It didn't matter if Robin was real. What mattered was the truth beneath the legend, the universal ache for fairness in an unequal world. Ballads like A of gave people a language to critique power without risking punishment. Singing "He robbed the rich to give to the poor" wasn't just entertainment, it was dissent set to melody. Royalty knew the power of these songs too well. When Richard the Lionheart's capture became the stuff of ballads, the public outcry pressured his ransom. Conversely, bad kings faced lyrical ridicule, like the Ballad of King John, which painted him as a bumbling tyrant. No decree could erase those verses once they'd taken root in popular memory. Ballads became the ultimate accountability, a check on authority written not in law, but in collective voice. What's fascinating is how these songs walk the line between fact and myth. The Wife of Ushers well tells of a mother's grief, so profound it summons her dead son's ghosts. Historians wouldn't call it factual, but for medieval listeners, it held deeper truths about love and loss that rang truer than any census. Ballads measured history not in dates, but in human stakes, the cost of war, the weight of love, the price of betrayal. They remind us that history isn't just what happened, it's what we can't afford to forget. Today, we see echoes of this in protest songs or viral news ballads. Think of how modern conflicts become folk anthems or how musicians turn headlines into hooks. The medium changes, but the mission stays the same: to make history hurt, to make it sing, to make it ours. Those medieval voices still whisper a challenge. Who gets to tell your story, and in whose key will it be sung? Every medieval parent knew the secret. If you wanted a child to remember a lesson, you wrapped it in a story. Take the tale of the boy who cried wolf, a fable that echoed through villages long before it reached Aesop's pages. In a world where trust meant survival, this simple narrative taught more about honesty than any sermon. But medieval storytellers didn't stop there. They adapted these tales to fit their world's sharp edges. Wolves became bandits, shepherd boys turned into apprentice knights, and the stakes always felt personal. The genius was in the details. A story about a fox outwitting a bear wasn't just about cleverness. It showed the weak how to navigate a world ruled by the strong. Religious parables took this further, blending scripture with everyday struggles. Picture a traveling friar performing the dance of death, where skeletons whirl peasants and kings alike into the grave. It wasn't macabre theater. It was a visceral reminder that status meant nothing when facing divine judgment. Even the architecture preached morality. Carved onto church walls, the labors of the months showed farmers that their toil was sacred, while gargoyles whispered that evil always lurked nearby. These weren't abstract ideas. They were lessons etched into stone and song, designed to guide behavior when priests weren't watching. Some of the sharpest lessons hid in humor. The Miller's Tale from collection, where a clever student outsmarts a jealous husband, delivered laughter with a sting. Yes, it mocked foolishness, but it also subtly questioned blind authority, showing audiences that wisdom could wear a beggar's cloak. Meanwhile, Marian Miracles, stories of the Virgin Mary saving repentant sinners, balanced justice with mercy, offering hope to those weighed down by feudal life's harshness. What's striking is how these tales crossed social lines. A noble's child heard versions of St. George and the dragon that emphasized duty, while peasant tellings focused on the dragon as a metaphor for tyranny. Same hero, different lessons, tailored to the listener's world. Even riddles and nursery rhymes carried hidden barbs. Ring around the may sound playful, but many scholars trace its origins to plague-era warnings about symptoms and mass graves. The brilliance of medieval morality tales lies in their duality. They comforted while they challenged, entertained while they indoctrinated. A story about a dishonest merchant might end with divine punishment, but it also validated listeners' frustrations with greedy tradesmen. These narratives gave people the language to critique their world without overt rebellion, wrapping dissent in allegory. When a modern audience groans at a predictable moral, they're missing the point. For medieval listeners, predictability was the power. The certainty that virtue would eventually triumph made hardship bearable, and the clarity of right versus wrong carved ethical compasses into collective memory. Today's blockbusters and fairy tale reboots still traffic in these ancient templates. Superheroes inherit the knights, moral codes, and Disney villains echo the wolf at the door. The medieval world understood something we often forget. The stories we repeat aren't just tales. They're the quiet architects of who we become. The troubadours of Provence didn't just sing about love, they reinvented it. In sun-drenched courts across southern France, these poet-musicians crafted a new language of devotion, one where longing was more noble than possession, and heartache became a kind of sacrament. Their, or love songs, weren't mere entertainment. They were a cultural revolution set to melody, transforming raw desire into an elaborate dance of restraint and reverence. Imagine a world where knights jousted not just for land, but for a lady's handkerchief, where love letters were as strategic as treaties, and a single ballad could make or break a noble's reputation. This was the power of courtly love, an idea so potent it reshaped medieval Europe's social fabric. At its heart lay a delicious contradiction. The troubadours celebrated passion while insisting it remain unconsummated. A knight might pledge eternal devotion to a married noblewoman, composing verses about her beauty, while accepting that she'd forever be just beyond his reach. Songs like S'ken la mover, When I See the Lark Beating Its Wings, turned unfulfilled yearning into an art form, equating emotional torment with spiritual refinement. It sounds masochistic to modern ears, but in a society rigidly bound by arranged marriages and political alliances, this idealized love offered something radical, a space where individual emotion mattered more than duty. The legend of Tristan and Isolde became the ultimate expression of this paradox. Their story, whispered in castles and carved into tapestries, wasn't a cautionary tale, but a glorification of love's destructive power. Even as they King Mark's trust, audiences wept for them, not in spite of their betrayal, but because of it. Their tragic end, drinking a potion that bound them eternally, wasn't framed as punishment, but as transcendence. Troubadours seized on this narrative, using it to argue that true love existed outside law, even outside morality. In a single stroke, they turned adultery into an act of sacred rebellion. Nobles didn't just listen to these ballads, they lived by them. The courts of love, presided over by powerful women like of Aquitaine, turned romantic etiquette into high-stakes theater. Knights submitted love letters for judgment, while ladies issued impossible challenges to prove devotion. A man might be ordered to wear his lady's colors in battle or wander the wilderness for a year, not to win her hand, but simply the right to adore her from afar. These weren't frivolous games. They were social experiments, testing whether chivalry could coexist with raw human emotion. Yet courtly love had sharp teeth beneath its velvet glove. When France penned about a knight loved by a fairy queen, she flipped the script. Here, the woman held all the power, rewarding loyalty with riches and vanishing when her trust was broken. Other troubadours, like the wrote from the female perspective, demanding reciprocity and passion. Her are so, I must sing of what I'd rather not, is a in wounded pride blending vulnerability with razor-sharp wit. These voices quietly challenged feudalism's hierarchies, suggesting that even in love, consent mattered more than rank. What's often overlooked is how these romantic ideals bled into politics. When Richard the Lionheart exchanged poetic verses with his rival-turned ally Philip II of France, their flowery language mirrored troubadour tropes, framing political alliances as affairs of the heart. Love poetry became diplomatic code, a way to negotiate without losing face. Conversely, satirical songs that mocked failed romances could undermine enemies more effectively than any battlefield. A duke humiliated in verse might find his influence crumbling at court, proving that the pen, or lute, truly was mightier than the sword. The troubadours' legacy echoes in everything from Shakespearean sonnets to modern rom-coms. Their greatest innovation wasn't the love story itself, but the idea that love could be a lens for critiquing power, for exploring identity, for reimagining society. They taught the medieval world that desire, when polished into poetry, could change more than just hearts. It could change history. Epic poems like Beowulf and the Song of Roland didn't just entertain, they forged identities. Picture a hall of Anglo-Saxon warriors, their faces flickering in firelight as a Scop's voice boomed the tale of Grendel's defeat. In that moment, the past wasn't just remembered, it was relived, binding listeners to a lineage of courage. These stories were more than myth, they were moral blueprints, teaching that heroism wasn't about invincibility, but about standing firm when darkness closed in. Beowulf's struggle against monsters wasn't fantasy. It was a metaphor for the chaos lurking beyond the mead hall's safety, a reminder that strength alone wasn't enough without loyalty and sacrifice. Across the Channel, the Song of Roland served a different but equally vital purpose. When the Frankish army sang of Roland's last stand at pass, they weren't mourning a defeat, they were celebrating a template for honor. Roland's refusal to blow his horn for help until it was too late might seem like pride to modern ears, but to medieval listeners, it was the ultimate act of feudal devotion. His death wasn't a failure, it was a lesson in how to die well, transforming a historical skirmish into a sacred narrative. Charlemagne's grief afterward wasn't just personal, it was communal, a shared loss that reinforced the idea of a Christian empire united against external threats. What's fascinating is how these epics adapted to their audiences. In Scandinavia, Beowulf emphasized the hero's generosity, a king's duty to share wealth, while Germanic versions of Roland focused on unwavering service to a lord. These weren't arbitrary changes. They reflected the values each culture needed to survive. A nomadic society like the Vikings prized individual prowess, but settled kingdoms required absolute loyalty to the crown. The poems became mirrors, showing each people not just who they were, but who they aspired to be. Even the monsters had meaning. Grendel's lineage, traced back to Cain, wasn't just horror, it was theology, a warning that evil spreads when community bonds break. The Saracens in Roland weren't faceless enemies, they were narrative foils, their treachery highlighting Frankish piety. These villains served a purpose beyond excitement. They defined the boundaries of belonging. To oppose them was to affirm one's place in the moral order. The endurance of these epics reveals their power. Long after the swords rusted and the kingdoms fell, the stories remained, carried by monks, quills, and minstrels' tongues. They became the DNA of nations, shaping languages, laws, and even modern politics. When 19th century nationalists revived Roland as a French icon, or when Beowulf resurfaced as England's literary birthright, They were tapping into an ancient truth that stories don't just describe a people, they create them. Today's blockbusters, from superhero sagas to war films, still follow this ancient formula. We might not gather in mead halls, but we flock to theaters, hungry for the same thing, tales that tell us who we are and why we matter. The medieval world knew something we often forget, that the most powerful battles aren't fought with swords, but with stories. Power always knows the value of a good story. In the medieval world, where most couldn't read the laws that bound them, narratives became the invisible chains, or the hidden keys to social order. Kings didn't just rule by sword and decree, they commissioned lavish tapestries like the Tapestry, where every stitch told a version of history that justified their conquests. Here was Harold the Oathbreaker, William the Righteous, a visual ballad weaving divine favor into the very fabric of power. The church, too, mastered this art. Mystery plays performed in town squares transformed biblical parables into living lessons, with Herod's tyranny mirroring the consequences of disobeying earthly and heavenly authority. Storytelling wasn't just culture, it was soft power with sharp teeth. But for every tale meant to control, there was another meant to unravel. Satirical fabliaux, those cheeky, often raunchy short stories, turned the moral order upside down. In The Priest's Tale, a greedy clergyman is outsmarted by a clever peasant, his hypocrisy laid bare for laughter. These weren't just jokes, they were acts of quiet rebellion, proving that ridicule could cut deeper than any blade. Even saints' lives, seemingly pious, sometimes carried hidden barbs. When communities celebrated local saints who corrupt bishops, they weren't just honoring holiness, they were endorsing resistance to institutional abuse. The ballads of outlaws like Robin Hood took this further, crafting counter-narratives where the dispossessed became heroes. Singing, in stod, in a tavern wasn't nostalgia. It was a dare, a fantasy where the poor reclaimed justice from the hands of sheriffs and abbots. Authorities tried to suppress these stories, but you can't ban what lives in the people's breath. The same ballads that nobles dismissed as vulgar thrived in the alleys they never walked, proof that storytelling could be the ultimate democracy. This tension between control and subversion played out in unexpected ways. Royal courts might sponsor chivalric romances glorifying knightly virtue, but minstrels slipped in verses about Lancelot's betrayal or Guinevere's desire, exposing the cracks in the system they were paid to celebrate. Meanwhile, peasant mothers telling Bluebeard, a tale of a murderous nobleman, weren't just scaring children, they were encoding warnings about the dangers lurking behind castle walls. What's striking is how fluid these narratives were. A story meant to enforce piety in one context could become a protest in another. The Dream of the Rood, an Old English poem about Christ's cross, initially reinforced church authority, until radical preachers used it to argue that divine suffering leveled social hierarchies. Even the Divine Comedy, Dante's epic journey through hell, began as orthodox theology, but was embraced by reformers as proof that popes could burn. This dance of narratives, official and underground, sacred and profane, shaped medieval life as surely as any law. It reminds us that stories are never neutral. They're where worldviews clash, where the powerless whisper back to power, and where the future is written long before it arrives. The lesson for us: whoever controls the stories controls far more than the past. They shape what's possible tomorrow. There's something almost magical about the way a shared story can turn strangers into neighbors. Imagine a bustling medieval market square at dusk, where the scent of roasting chestnuts mingles with the tang of iron from the blacksmith's shop. A crowd gathers, not around a screen, but a lone figure, perhaps a traveling storyteller or a local elder, whose voice rises above the murmur of the crowd. As the tale unfolds, something remarkable happens. A merchant clutching his wares forgets to haggle. A weary farmer leans forward, his calloused hands loosening around his hoe. Children, sticky-fingered from honey cakes, freeze mid-giggle. In that moment, the story isn't just heard. It felt collectively. A gasp here, a knowing chuckle there, the collective lean during a suspenseful pause. This wasn't just entertainment, it was social glue. Unlike today's solitary scrolling or silent reading, medieval storytelling demanded physical presence. The warmth of a fire on your face, the elbow brush of a neighbor, the way a skilled teller would lock eyes with different listeners. These weren't incidental details. They were the essence of the experience. When a minstrel sang of a dragon's roar, you didn't just hear it. You saw the wide-eyed child across from you flinch, felt the ripple of tension through the crowd. Shared reactions became part of the narrative itself. A village that laughed together at a clever peasant outwitting a lord, or wept together at a ballad of lost love, wasn't just sharing emotions, it was reinforcing communal values. Those collective gasps and nods were silent agreements. This is who we are. This is what we believe. The participatory nature of these gatherings blurred the line between artist and audience. Listeners weren't passive consumers, they were co-creators. A well-known refrain in a ballad would have the whole crowd joining in, their voices thickening the chorus. In mystery plays performed by guilds, local butchers or bakers might play angels or devils, turning theology into something tactile and familiar. Even the interruptions, a shouted warning to a doomed hero, a hissed insult at a villain, were part of the ritual. This wasn't rudeness, it was ownership. The story belonged to everyone present, shaped by their reactions as much as by the teller's words. Seasonal rhythms deepen this bond. The same tale told at midsummer might take on new shades when recounted during the long nights of winter. Harvest festivals saw rollicking stories of abundance, while Lenten tellings leaned toward penitence or moral allegories. The cyclical retelling of certain narratives, like the annual recitation of a town's founding myth during its patron saint's feast, didn't grow stale. It gained resonance, like a well-worn path that feels more sacred with each pilgrimage. Modern life has its own versions of this. Think of stadiums chanting in unison at a concert, or theaters erupting in collective laughter. But the medieval world understood something we've diluted, that shared stories don't just reflect community, they actively build it. When voices rise together in refrain, when strangers exchange glances over a well-told jest, the story becomes more than words. It becomes a handshake across the firelight, a silent promise that no one has to face the dragons, real or imagined, alone. Melodies didn't just carry medieval ballads, they preserved them like amber. Think of a tune you can't shake, one that loops in your head for days. Now imagine that earworm holding entire histories, legal disputes, or moral codes intact across generations. The secret lay in the structure. Those repeating refrains and predictable rhythms weren't artistic choices. They were memory technology. A ballad like Lord Randall hinges on its relentless, "What ye leave to your mother, Lord Randall, my son." Each recurrence acts like a mental bookmark, letting singers reconstruct verses even decades later. Oral cultures from West Africa to the Scottish Highlands used similar tricks, proving that melody isn't just decoration for stories, it's their life support system. The genius was in the constraints. Ballads often followed strict meters, four-line stanzas, alternating rhymes, beats that matched the thud of a walking pace or the clop of horse hooves. These patterns turned words into muscle memory. A medieval peasant might forget a sermon's finer points, but the rising cadence of Barbara in Scarlet Town, where I was born, lodged in their bones. Scholars call this the oral formulaic style, where stock phrases, blood-red wine, milk-white steed, served as prefab building blocks. A performer could stitch them together like musical Legos, adapting tales on the fly without losing the core. But the real magic happened in performance. Picture a minstrel not just singing, but embodying the story, hands miming sword strokes, voice dropping to a whisper for treachery, feet stamping the refrain's downbeat. The rhythm became a shared pulse, synchronizing the crowd's breathing. When a ballad described a lover's death, the singer's slowing tempo dragged listeners into the grief. A battle scene's accelerating tempo had hearts racing alongside the heroes. This wasn't passive listening. It was collective time travel, with melody as the vehicle. Even the silences held power. The gap between verses let audiences murmur reactions, stitching their own emotions into the narrative. A well-placed pause before the villain's reveal cranked tension than any lute string. And because these songs lived in communal spaces, taverns, fields, pilgrim roads, each retelling absorbed local flavor. A Robin Hood ballad might gain a new villain in Nottingham, while Yorkshire versions emphasized his generosity. The melodies stayed recognizable, but like rivers, they carried whatever the land fed them. Today's neuroscience backs what medieval bards knew instinctively. Music activates more brain regions than speech alone. Melody lights up the hippocampus, memory's vault, and the amygdala emotions switchboard, while rhythm syncs with the cerebellum's timing circuits. That's why you remember lyrics from childhood better than last week's grocery list. The medieval world weaponized this wiring, turning ballads into the ultimate sticky notes, ones that survived plagues, wars, and the slow creep of time. So next time you absent-mindedly hum a pop song, you're tapping into an ancient superpower. Those catchy hooks, they're the descendants of troubadour tricks, proof that the right tune can make words outlast empires. The ballads that echo down to us did so not because they were written down, but because they were impossible to forget. Behind every cradle song and hearthside tale, there were voices history often forgot, women weaving wisdom into the very fabric of medieval life. While scribes recorded grand epics in parchment, mothers and grandmothers spun stories that lingered in the air like the scent of drying herbs, teaching children which plants healed and which harmed through rhymes as sticky as burrs. A lullaby about wolves wasn't just to soothe. It carried warnings about the forest's edge. A chant while kneading bread might encode the phases of the moon for planting. These weren't merely domestic rituals. They were acts of cultural preservation, where women served as living libraries long before convents or courts acknowledged their craft. Frances offer a rare glimpse into this hidden world. Written in the 12th century, her poems, like The Nightingale or blend Arthurian romance with subversive wit, placing women's desires and dilemmas at the center. But was the exception, a noblewoman whose literacy granted her a voice in the record. For every, there were countless unnamed women shaping stories orally. recounting tales of miraculous births to calm laboring mothers, village elders using fables to mediate disputes, or Brewsters turning ale-making into allegories of patience and transformation. Their narratives thrived in the spaces men seldom entered: birth chambers, kitchen gardens, washing streams, where lessons flowed as freely as the water. Consider the humble spinning bee, where women gathered to card wool by firelight. As spindles turned, so did stories, gossip about local scandals, yes, but also recycled myths refitted for new ears. A tale about a clever goose girl might secretly critique arranged marriages, while a ghost story about a wronged washerwoman could reinforce communal justice. Even nursery rhymes held double meanings. Ring Around This Playful Dance may have roots in plague-era trauma, a way to process collective grief through children's games. These storytellers didn't just pass down tales, they encrypted survival strategies in plain sight. Herbalists mastered this art brilliantly. A woman teaching her daughter to recognize foxglove might wrap the lesson in a ballad about a fairy's glove, its purple bells both poison and medicine. Such stories weren't whimsy, they were mnemonic tools, ensuring dangerous knowledge was remembered rhythmically. Similarly, weaving songs often counted stitches while recounting legends, tying practical skill to mythic archetypes. The loom's shuttle moved in time with the singer's voice, binding utility to beauty. The Church's suspicion of wise women reveals how potent these oral traditions were. When male clerics dismissed herb wives as superstitious, they feared not the remedies, but the authority these women held as keepers of alternative knowledge. A peasant might trust a local healer's story-infused advice over a Latin prayer, undermining clerical control. Even saints' legends borrowed from these oral wells. Many miracles attributed to female saints mirror older folk cures, sanitized for orthodoxy. What's lost when we overlook these storytellers? Not just half the medieval world's creativity, but the very texture of daily life. The ballads of courts and battlefields survive in manuscripts, but the whispers that shaped childhoods, healed bodies, and challenged power often faded with the last breath of their tellers. Yet traces remain. In the stubborn persistence of fairy tales where clever maidens outwit giants, in the rhythms of folk songs still sung at harvest, in the way certain phrases once upon a time. Listen, and I'll tell still summon that ancient, collective hush around the fire. The medieval world's greatest untold story might be how women spun thread and tales alike into something unbreakable. Festivals weren't just breaks from toil in the medieval calendar. They were portals where stories came alive, shifting with the seasons like leaves on an oak. When winter's grip tightened and Yule logs crackled, families huddled close not just for warmth, but for tales of the uncanny. Ghost stories flourished in the long nights, not to terrify, but to explain the unexplainable. The creak of a frozen branch became a restless spirit, the howling wind a chorus of the dead. These weren't mere superstitions. They were coping mechanisms for a world where darkness literally lingered for months. The Icelandic Yule lads, mischievous spirits who visited homes in December, started as warnings to children about winter's dangers. Don't wander out, don't waste food. But over time, their antics softened into playful folklore, proving how stories adapt to comfort as much as caution. Come spring, the tone flipped. May Day's bonfires and flower crowns set the stage for tales bursting with life, fertility myths where maidens danced with forest spirits and young men leaped over flames to prove their vigor. The green man, his face woven from leaves, peered down from church carvings despite clerical disapproval, a pagan holdover whispering of nature's unstoppable force. Villagers didn't see contradiction in blending these motifs with Christian themes. To them, the resurrection of Christ and the rebirth of the land were threads in the same tapestry. A sermon about St. George might seamlessly segue into a local legend of a dragon slain to free a spring, both celebrating triumph over stagnation. Harvest festivals spun yet another thread. In English villages, the harvest home feast featured songs where corn dollies, effigies woven from the last sheaf, were paraded like royalty. These rituals weren't empty tradition. They were gratitude made tangible, stories without words. The dollies embodied the spirit of the crop, honored so it would return next year. Even the act of sharing the harvest meal reinforced communal bonds, with ballads like John Barleycorn turning the cycle of sowing, reaping, and brewing into an epic of sacrifice and renewal. The church's clever co-opting of pagan festivals reveals storytelling's power as a cultural negotiator. Christmas absorbed Saturnalia's revelry, Easter folded in symbols, and All Saints' Day tempered Samhain's ghosts into holy souls. Rather than erase old tales, clergy repurposed them, grafting new meanings onto familiar roots. A parish priest might condemn fairies on Sunday, but privately share his grandmother's tale of a kindly household brownie, proof that folklore persisted in the cracks of dogma. What's mesmerizing is how these seasonal stories created a kind of communal clock. Just as birds migrate or bears hibernate, humans marked time through narrative rhythms: spring's courtship ballads, summer's heroic quests, autumn's gratitude, winter's introspection. The stories weren't just about the seasons. They were the seasons lived and felt. Today's holiday specials and horror movie traditions are distant echoes of this instinct, proof that even now, we still let the year's turning tell us when to laugh, when to mourn, and when to gather close in the flickering dark. Stories could cut deeper than any sword, and in the wrong hands, they became weapons. Take the chanson Roland, where the Saracens weren't just adversaries. They were caricatures, their faces blackened by verse into monstrous pagans who scorned God. This wasn't accidental. It was calculated. When minstrels sang these lines in town squares, they weren't recounting history. They were scripting holy war, turning complex political conflicts into cosmic battles of good versus evil. The same poem that celebrated Roland's heroism also erased the humanity of Muslim allies who'd fought alongside Franks in real life, proving how stories could rewrite reality to fit a crusader's cross. The blood libel myth reveals an even darker alchemy, how fiction could become fatal. Starting in 12th century England, ballads accused Jewish communities of horrifying rituals, like using Christian children's blood in Passover bread. Never mind that Jewish law strictly forbids consuming blood. The tales spread like wildfire, set to catchy melodies that made them impossible to dislodge. Villagers who'd never met a Jewish person could hum every verse, their fear stoked by rhymes designed to linger. These weren't just songs. They were matches tossed into tinder, sparking pogroms from York to Prague. The stories outlived their victims, echoing for centuries in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice and beyond, a testament to narrative's terrifying endurance. Even saints' lives weren't immune. The legend of Little of Lincoln, a boy allegedly murdered by Jews in 1255, was enshrined in ballads and pilgrim badges, his shrine drawing devotees who'd never questioned the lie. Prioress's tale later recycled the trope, proving how literary prestige could sanctify slander. Meanwhile, crusade recruitment songs like Chevalier Est's Knight, You Are Most Blessed promised salvation for killing, blending spiritual rewards with battlefield adrenaline. The church didn't just tolerate these tales, it amplified them, turning pulpits into stages for holy propaganda. Yet resistance flickered in the margins. Some troubadours, like the anonymous author of The Jew's Daughter, subverted the blood libel by humanizing its targets, hinting at a counter-narrative whispered in alleys. Jewish communities fought back with their own stories, like where clever rabbis outwitted bloodthirsty lords through wit and faith. These countertales rarely reached the mainstream, but their existence matters. They remind us that for every story weaponized, others tried to heal the wounds. The lesson isn't just medieval. From wartime posters to viral smears, the mechanics haven't changed, only the mediums. Those old ballads hold up a cracked mirror. Stories can uplift or destroy, unite or divide, depending on who holds the pen or the lute. When the Black Death stripped villages bare, leaving empty cradles and silent hearths, stories became the last thread holding sanity together. Imagine a mother crouched in a smoke-filled sick room, whispering not prayers but perhaps of Saint, the plague saint who healed with a touch, or the dance of death, where skeletons led rich and poor alike to the grave. These weren't just distractions, they were lifelines, offering a script for suffering when reality had none. In a world where medicine failed and priests fled, narrative stepped in as both doctor and theologian, diagnosing chaos as divine trial and framing survival as sacred triumph. Ballads like Of the Pestilence didn't shy from horror. They sang of bodies piled like firewood, of lovers parting through shuttered windows, but always with a refrain: "This too shall pass." Embedded in the grief was a roadmap for endurance, echoing older tales of famines survived or floods weathered. A Scottish shepherd might not know the science behind contagion, but he knew the Ballad of Tam, where love broke a curse, proof that even the darkest magic had an end. These stories didn't just console, they weaponized memory, reminding listeners that their grandparents had faced wolves and winter and lived to tell. The church's fire and brimstone sermons tapped into the same need. When priests framed plague as God's wrath for sin, they weren't inventing fear. They were channeling it into a narrative people could do something about. Repentance processions and flagellant hymns turned helplessness into action, however futile. Meanwhile, apocryphal tales of the three living and the three dead, where kings confront their rotting, mocked the vanity of social hierarchies, offering a grim comfort. Death was the only true democracy. Yet the most subversive stories bloomed in the cracks of orthodoxy. Herbalists whispered of the White Lady, a spectral healer who wandered plague-stricken towns, leaving remedies on doorsteps. Whether she was a folk memory of merciful nuns or pure fiction didn't matter. She filled the void where earthly help fell short. Similarly, memento art, skulls carved into choir stalls, hourglasses embroidered on vestments, morphed from morbid threats into companions, teaching audiences to live with death rather than just fear it. Even humor carved out a space for resilience. Fablios like the plague survivors' feast reveled in gallows wit, with peasants toasting their dead landlords' wine cellars. Laughter here wasn't denial, it was defiance, a way to stare into the abyss and mock its fashion sense. The same communities that sang solemn hymns by day might share raunchy parodies by night, because survival required both tears and gritted teeth. What's haunting is how these crisis stories mirror our own. Today's pandemic folklore, from super spreader patient zero tales to balcony singing, follows the same blueprint. Fear shaped into narrative, isolation softened by shared tropes. The medieval world understood something we're relearning, that when reality fractures, we don't just need facts. We need stories sturdy enough to bridge the gaps, to turn victims into witnesses, and to whisper across centuries, "You are not the first. You will not be the last." For centuries, stories lived in breath and memory. Then came the quiet revolution of the written word. Picture a monastic scriptorium in the 12th century, where a monk's quill scratches across vellum, freezing a once fluid into ink. This wasn't just preservation, it was transformation. The moment a story left a bard's lips and landed on parchment, something fundamental changed. Oral tales had always been slippery things, adapting to each teller's voice and audience's size. But writing anchored them, giving them a permanence that terrified some and thrilled others. A ballad about a drowned lover might vary wildly from village to village, until someone wrote it down, cementing one version as the version. Yet for all it fixed, writing also liberated stories to travel farther than any minstrel's feet could carry them. Take the Canterbury Tales, a masterpiece that captured the raucous energy of oral storytelling while exploiting the new power of text. His pilgrims, bawdy jokes, and moral parables read like transcripts of tavern chatter, complete with interruptions and digressions. But now, instead of vanishing into the air, those voices could be revisited centuries later, whispering across time. Manuscript copies spread like wildfire among the emerging literate class, from merchants to minor nobles, creating a shared cultural reference point that oral tradition alone could never achieve. The wife of Bath's opinions on marriage might scandalize one reader and delight another, but the text itself didn't change, only its interpretations did. This shift wasn't seamless. Some mourned the loss of oral storytelling's spontaneity, the way a skilled teller could tweak a tale to fit the room's mood. Written stories couldn't smell a crowd's restlessness and pivot to a livelier plot. But writing offered its own magic, layers of meaning that only revealed themselves upon rereading. A phrase scribbled in the margin of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, perhaps a monk's wry commentary on the hero's pride, became part of the story's afterlife, a conversation across generations that oral tellers couldn't sustain. The Church's embrace of writing as a tool for doctrine inadvertently fueled storytelling's evolution. Monks copying Bibles began slipping in local legends between psalms, a saint's miracle here, a dragon slaying there, blurring the line between scripture and folklore. These marginalia weren't just doodles. They were the subconscious of medieval culture, where official dogma and grassroots imagination coexisted. Over time, secular scribes borrowed the Church's methods, crafting illuminated manuscripts where dragons coiled around capital letters and knights jousted in the borders. The written word hadn't killed oral storytelling. It had given it a new costume. Yet the old ways lingered stubbornly. Even as printed books proliferated, street performers kept oral traditions alive, adapting written stories back into spoken word. A minstrel might sing a ballad from a broadsheet, then improvise verses to mock the local lord, a hybrid art form that kept storytelling democratic. The tension between fixed text and fluid performance birthed something extraordinary, a culture where a peasant could quote and a scholar could enjoy a ribald, all while the written and spoken worlds cross-pollinated. What's often overlooked is how this shift altered the very nature of memory. Oral cultures prized recall, the ability to reconstruct a tale from mental scaffolding of rhythms and formulas. Literacy rewarded something new, the skill of critical reading, of comparing versions, of seeing stories as objects to analyze rather than spells to absorb. The transition birthed a new kind of audience, one that could flip back a page to catch a lie, or savor a metaphor until its meaning bloomed. Today, as we swipe through screens flooded with ephemeral tweets and enduring ebooks, we're replaying that medieval moment, still wrestling with what's gained and lost when stories trade breath for bites. The scribes and minstrels would recognize our dilemma, the thrill of reaching millions, the grief of losing the firelit hush where every telling was a one-night-only event. Their world reminds us that every medium reshapes the message, but the human hunger to tell and be told remains the same. A knight rides through a storm-lashed forest, but whether he's a noble hero or a bumbling fool depends entirely on which side of the Rhine you're listening from. In Germany, the same tale that paints him as Siegfried the Dragon Slayer might cast him as Sir Gawain's comic foil in England, or a troubadour in Provence. These weren't accidental tweaks, they were narrative fingerprints, revealing how each region's fears, ideals, and grudges seeped into its stories. Take the werewolf legends that thrived in Brittany's misty woodlands. Locals spoke of a nobleman cursed to prowl as a beast, but retaining his courtly manners. Cross into Germanic lands, and werewolves became savage incarnations of wilderness, reflecting deeper anxieties about the untamed borders of civilization. Food itself told regional tales. English versions of the fox and the grapes might feature ale and mutton, while Italian tellings swapped in wine and olives. These details weren't just set dressing, they grounded stories in the sensory world listeners knew. A French peasant hearing about a feast of baguettes and brie would feel the tale's truth in their bones, while a Norse saga's description of smoked herring carried the tang of their own pantry. Even humor shifted borders. Fablios about cuckolded husbands landed differently in Flanders, bustling textile towns, than in Burgundy's wine country, each region projecting its own social tensions onto the punchlines. Political undercurrents ran deeper still. The Robin Hood ballads gained explosive popularity in England's north, where resentment against absentee landlords and heavy forest laws ran hot. Yet in France, outlaw tales often centered on prodigal sons, wayward nobles redeemed by loyalty to the crown, flattering centralizing monarchies. Meanwhile, Swiss Alpine communities spun stories of William Tell's Appleshot not as rebellion, but as communal defiance, mirroring their real-life struggles against Habsburg rule. The same archetypes, the rebel, the trickster, the martyr, morphed to fit local power struggles like armor hammered to fit its wearer. Religious flavors varied just as sharply. Spanish cantigas blended Marian miracles with Moorish musical scales, creating oral mosaics of coexistence and conquest. In Scandinavia, Christian saints quietly absorbed traits of Thor and Freyja. Saint Olaf's miracles sometimes echoed Thor's hammer strikes, easing pagan converts into new devotion. These adaptations weren't compromises. They were survival tactics, ensuring stories kept their grip on hearts even as beliefs evolved. The true magic lay in how these variations spoke to one another. A merchant traveling the Champagne fairs might hear a Breton one night and a Tuscan morality play the next, spotting the shared DNA beneath the dialects. Stories became cultural currency, exchanged and reminted at every border. When a Saxon bard sang of dragons hoarding gold, he might not realize his imagery echoed Slavic tales or Welsh wyvern lore, but his audience, consciously or not, sensed they were part of a larger tapestry. Today's globalized world has blurred these regional quirks, but traces linger in the way urban legends adapt to local landmarks, or how Netflix shows get remade with regional inside jokes. The medieval world whispers a reminder. There's no such thing as a universal story, only universal yearnings refracted through the prisms of place. A tale untethered from its soil might travel far, but it's the dirt under its nails that makes it real. A child goes missing near the forest's edge, and by sundown the village knows, not by search parties, but by the hushed certainty that the fairies took her. In medieval Europe, the supernatural wasn't escapism. It was the lens through which people decoded their world. When crops failed, it wasn't just bad weather. It was the anger of elves trampling the fields. A fever that stole a healthy man by dawn. Clearly the work of a vengeful spirit, not some invisible miasma. These stories did more than send shivers down spines. They mapped the boundaries of the known and the feared, turning chaos into something with rules, however eerie. Take the widespread belief in the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of spectral riders said to tear across the sky during storms. In Scandinavia, it was Odin leading the charge. In Wales, it became King Arthur and his knights. The details shifted, but the core remained. This was nature's fury, a story that transformed random thunder into a narrative of pursuit and punishment. Farmers hearing that cacophony overhead didn't just hear noise. They understood it as a warning to mend their ways or hide their children. The tale gave them a script to follow. Leave out offerings, nail Rowan wood above the door, actions that restored a sense of control when the world felt ungovernable. Saints' miracles functioned similarly, but with divine paperwork. When a well dried up, communities didn't just dig deeper. They prayed to whose legends told of her staff summoning springs from barren earth. If the water returned, it wasn't geology. It was proof of her intercession. These stories weren't. They were adaptive. A village celebrating feast day to ward off ergot poisoning, dubbed Sfire, might not know the fungus caused their hallucinations, but they knew the ritual worked. The miracle was both medicine and metaphor, a way to package cause and effect in an age before microscopes. Then there were the boundary beings, creatures like brownies, house spirits who'd help with chores if respected, or knockers in Cornish mines, whose tapping guided miners to ore but could also lead them to collapse. These beings inhabited liminal spaces, doorways, chimneys, the edges of fields. Their stories practical taboos. Don't skimp on the milk left out for the brownie, or your bread won't rise. What we'd call superstition was, in truth, a system of risk management, where narratives enforced behaviors that likely did improve outcomes, even if the rationale was mystical. Ghost stories held particular power, serving as medieval cold cases. The revenant haunting the bridge wasn't just a spooky tale. It was a communal memory of a murder unresolved, a demand for justice echoing beyond the grave. When a spirit appeared dripping wet, pointing to a pond, the community might dredge it and find a body, turning folklore into forensic tool. These ghosts weren't passive specters. They were active participants in social order, enforcing oaths, exposing secrets, or collecting debts that the living had ignored. Yet the supernatural wasn't all dread. The Green Children of, a 12th century account of emerald-skinned siblings found in a Suffolk field, blurred wonder with terror. Were they fairy offspring, travelers from a subterranean world, or just malnourished refugees? The story's persistence, recorded by monks yet dripping with pagan strangeness, hints at how medieval minds straddled belief and skepticism. Even as the church condemned superstition, it co-opted these tales, turning fairy mounds into sites of saintly visions and demonizing older deities as fallen angels. What's revealing is how fluidly these narratives adapted to new fears. As plague ravaged Europe, encounters with the White Ladies, ghostly healers, proliferated, while stories of demonic plague spreaders, often scapegoating Jews or lepers, showed the darker side of supernatural explanation. The same impulse to personify forces beyond control birthed both comfort and cruelty, proving that stories could be as double-edged as any sword. Today's ghost hunters and alien abductees aren't so far removed. When we joke about haunted houses or cosmic conspiracies, we're tapping into that same ancient itch to name the unnamed, to shape the shapeless. The medieval world simply had fewer barriers between the seen and unseen, fewer labels for metaphor. For them, the supernatural wasn't a genre. It was the operating system of a world where everything, from the rustle of leaves to the ache of loss, had a voice if you knew how to listen. Every child in the Middle Ages knew the sting of the wolf's teeth, not from real danger, but from the fable's warning echoing in their ears. Stories weren't mere bedtime distractions. They were the first classrooms, where lessons about trust, courage, and consequence hid beneath the guise of talking animals and enchanted forests. A mother rocking her child by the hearth might murmur the fox and the grapes, turning sour disappointment into a lifelong lesson about resilience. A father mending fishing nets could recount the boy who cried wolf, weaving vigilance into the fabric of his child's mind long before they ever tended sheep. These tales were survival tools disguised as entertainment, sharpening young wits against a world where a single misstep could mean hunger, danger, or worse. Lullabies carried their own kind of magic. The same melody that lulled a babe to sleep might encode warnings about wandering too close to the millstream or speaking to strangers. "Hush-a-bye, baby," on the treetop wasn't just a soothing rhythm. It was a whispered reminder of life's precariousness, set to a tune gentle enough to cradle fear into submission. Even nursery rhymes like "Rock-a-bye Baby," with its ominous falling cradle, prepared children for a world where safety was fragile, wrapping hard truths in melodies soft enough to stomach. For girls, stories often doubled as domestic training. Tales like "Or the Handless Maiden" wove lessons about resourcefulness and endurance into narratives where cleverness outmatched brute strength. A daughter carding wool might hear how Princess Allkind outwitted a witch with patience and a humble spindle, internalizing that virtue wasn't just piety, it was strategy. Boys, meanwhile, heard echoes of their expected roles. Jack the Giant Killer reframed recklessness as heroism, while Arthurian legends molded ideals of chivalry long before they ever held a sword. The brilliance of these tales lay in their elasticity. A story told in a peat-smoked Scottish croft might emphasize thrift and wit, while the same plot in a bustling Flemish market town highlighted trade and negotiation. Regional dangers seeped into the lore. Coastal villages spun yarns of mermaids luring fishermen to doom, while mountain communities warned of ice spirits that stole disobedient children. Each variation wasn't just local color. It was a cultural inoculation, preparing young minds for the specific perils they'd face. Religious instruction crept in through side doors. St. George and the dragon might decorate church walls, but in retelling, the dragon morphed into whatever threat loomed largest, a metaphor for plague, war, or even a child's own temper. Miracles of saints healing the sick or feeding the hungry became parables about charity and faith, while cautionary tales of punished sinners taught self-control without a single scripture quoted. The church knew what every parent did: wrap the medicine in honey, and it goes down easier. Play itself was narrative training. Ring Around the wasn't just a game. It was a physical story about the plague's ravages, its falling motion cementing the memory of collective loss through generations. Even riddles and tongue twisters honed quick thinking and verbal dexterity, skills as vital as any weapon in a world where clever words could diffuse a quarrel or win a patron. What's haunting is how these medieval strategies mirror modern parenting. Today's cartoons teaching sharing or resilience through animated adventures aren't so different from Aesop's fables. The medium changes, but the mission remains: to armor children with wisdom before the world demands they use it. Those long-ago mothers and minstrels would nod in recognition at our Daniel Tiger songs, proof that the oldest stories never die. They just find new voices. The echoes of medieval storytelling reverberate through every fantasy novel you've ever lost yourself in, every cinematic epic that's left you breathless. Take the hero's journey, that timeless arc of a humble figure rising to greatness. It didn't spring from Hollywood screenwriters. It was forged in the fires of Beowulf and Sir Gawain, where protagonists faced monsters both literal and moral. The medieval world understood something profound. True transformation requires trials. Modern protagonists to walk paths paved by those ancient warriors, their battles against darkness mirroring the same existential stakes that once held mead halls spellbound. Then there's the wise mentor, the and Dumbledores who guide heroes toward their destinies. This archetype didn't originate with. It's rooted in figures like Merlin from Arthurian legend or the cryptic hermits of medieval romances. These characters were more than plot devices. They embodied the medieval reverence for wisdom passed down through generations. In a world without formal education, the mentor was the bridge between ignorance and enlightenment, their cryptic advice and sudden disappearances teaching self-reliance alongside obedience. Today's gruff but kindly guides, from Star Wars' Obi-Wan to Harry Potter's, inherit this dual role. They equip heroes with tools, then push them out of the nest. Good versus evil. Medieval storytellers turned that dichotomy into an art form. The stark morality of the Song of Roland, where Saracens are irredeemable villains, evolved into more nuanced conflicts, like Game of Thrones, morally gray landscapes. Yet even modern tales that blur the lines still rely on medieval scaffolding. The White Walkers aren't so different from the ice giants of Norse myth, both embodying existential threats that unite fractured kingdoms. What's changed isn't the structure, but the shading. We've traded black and white for charcoal and slate, yet the contrasts still grip us. Fantasy worlds themselves are medieval tapestries rewoven. The Lord of the Rings, Middle-earth, mirrors the fractured realms of post-Roman Europe, while The Witcher's continent drips with Slavic folklore's grim beauty. Even sci-fi borrows from the trove. Dune's feudal politics and chosen one narrative could have been lifted from a crusader's chronicle. These settings endure because they're more than escapism. They're mirrors reflecting our own societal fractures and aspirations. Much like Arthur's, Camelot mirrored medieval yearnings for order amid chaos. The most fascinating adaptations are the ones that subvert the old templates. Briar Rose's sleeping princess becomes Maleficent's complex anti-heroine, just as medieval ballads sometimes flipped script on villainy. A Knight's Tale injects modern rock anthems into jousting tournaments, echoing how minstrels once blended contemporary tunes into ancient tales. These twists aren't anachronisms. They're proof that medieval storytelling was always adaptive, always alive. So the next time you lose yourself in a dragon battle or a quest for a holy grail, listen closely. Beneath the CGI and the glossy covers, you'll hear the whisper of a minstrel's lute, the creak of a scribe's quill, and the collective gasp of villagers gathered in firelight. The stories haven't faded. They've simply found new tongues. Every voice that falls silent takes a universe of stories with it. Imagine a medieval midwife who knew 100 healing chants, or a traveling bard whose ballads carried the history of an entire clan. Now picture them vanishing in a plague outbreak or a village raid, their tales extinguished mid-breath. These weren't just entertainments lost. They were libraries burning. Oral tradition was a fragile flame, passed hand to hand like a candle in the wind, and when the wind won, whole worlds of wisdom turned to smoke. Take the Mabinogion, Wales's legendary story cycle. We only know it today because some anonymous scribe, centuries after its telling, decided to jot it down. How many other epics, just as rich, just as vital, slipped away because no quill was near when the last keeper died? The Saxon, a wandering poet's catalog of kings and battles, survives as a tantalizing fragment, its gaps hinting at a tapestry now frayed beyond repair. Even famous works like Beowulf teetered on the edge. The single manuscript we have nearly crumbled in a fire, a reminder that survival was often luck, not design. Migration scattered stories like seeds on stone. When Vikings raided, they didn't just loot gold. They shattered the thread of monastic storytelling that had stretched back generations. Irish monks fleeing invaders carried some tales to Europe, but others drowned with the ships that never made it. The Slavic, heroic poems sung for centuries faded as Moscow's centralizing power suppressed regional voices. Each conquest, each border redrawn, wasn't just political change, it was a cultural amputation. Yet paradoxically, this fragility made stories stronger in the moment. Knowing tales could vanish made communities cling to them. The Cherokee proverb, "When an elder dies, a library burns," would rung true in medieval Europe. Storytellers weren't just artists. They were emergency responders, racing against time to drill essential knowledge into the young. A mother teaching her daughter a weaving song wasn't just passing down time. She was encrypting survival skills in melody, ensuring that even if the village burned, the craft would live. Some losses cut deeper than others. The pre-Christian myths of the Anglo-Saxons survive only in shreds, filtered through monks who often distorted them. We know the Norse pantheon so well partly because Iceland's isolation preserved the Eddas, while England's pagan stories melted into the mists. What gods, what heroes, what explanations for the stars disappeared when the last baptized storyteller drew breath? The eerie gaps in folklore, like the near-total absence of English dragon tales compared to Wales's vibrant traditions, hint at whole mythic continents now sunk beneath time's waves. But here's the twist: even silence speaks. The holes in our knowledge map the contours of what mattered. The fact that Arthurian legends exploded across Europe while equally compelling Celtic heroes faded tells us which narratives had royal patronage, which crossed language barriers, which fed a hunger no other story could. The stories that vanished were often the ones too local, too subversive, or too tied to a dying way of life, like the whispers of medieval peasants that didn't flatter their lords enough to be recorded. Modern archives brim with manuscripts, yet we're repeating the same pattern. Today's digital folk tales, memes, viral tweets, campfire ghost stories flare bright and vanish faster than a scribe's candle. The difference is scale. A medieval village might lose a dozen tales to time. We risk losing millions in the click of a server shutdown. Those long-ago voices whisper a warning across the centuries. Stories only live as long as someone breathes them. Every time we retell an old myth or spin a new one, we're not just entertaining, we're standing guard against the dark. A whispered ballad could topple a king faster than any sword, if you knew how to listen between the verses. When peasants in 14th century England rose up during the Peasants' Revolt, their anger didn't just burn in torchlit mobs. It smoldered in the lyrics of songs like the Wren, a seemingly innocent folk tune about hunting a small bird. But beneath the surface, the Wren symbolized the aristocracy, and the gruesome details of dismembering it will chop him up. Bone by bone were thinly veiled calls for rebellion. Authorities caught on too late. By the time they banned the song, it had already become the soundtrack of insurrection, proof that melodies could carry revolution where speeches couldn't. The Jacquerie uprising in France played out similarly. Peasants, forbidden from gathering to discuss grievances, turned Saints' Day festivals into covert planning sessions, masking sedition as piety. Carols praising John the Baptist morphed into anthems demanding fair grain prices, their familiar refrains letting conspirators recognize allies without exchanging a single treasonous word. Even children's rhymes became tools. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This couplet, attributed to radical priest John Ball, reduced feudalism's entire hierarchy to absurdity with just 12 words, echoing through villages until it ignited a movement. Textile workers in Flanders took the craft even further. Their drapers' songs seemingly about weaving were rife with double meanings. Lyrics about tangled threads and broken looms lamented exploitative wages, while references to the shears of justice hinted at retribution. Guild masters, often literate, transcribed these songs as harmless workshop ditties, missing the subversion until strikes erupted. The songs' very mundanity was their armor. no lord would crack down on a tune hummed over a spinning wheel. The most ingenious resistance narratives thrived in allegory. Reynard the Fox, a beast epic popular among the lower classes, starred a cunning fox outwitting noble predators like Lord Lion and Sir Wolf. To aristocrats, it was amusing fantasy. To serfs, it was a manual for surviving oppression. Reynard's tricks, forging documents, exploiting legal loopholes, mirrored real-life peasant strategies, turning satire into survival tactics. Even Aesop's fables were repurposed. The Mice in Council, where rodents debate a cat, became a parable about organizing against tyrannical bailiffs. Religious stories provided even deeper cover. Lollards, England's proto-Protestant reformers, spread their critiques of the church through nativity plays, where King Herod's cruelty mirrored contemporary bishops' corruption. Audience cheers for the Magi's escape were tacit endorsements of Dissent. In Bohemia, Hussite rebels rewrote hymns to celebrate martyrs of their cause, blending piety with politics until the two were inseparable. When authorities cracked down on overt rebellion, they found themselves helpless against verses sung in pews. This tradition of coded defiance never truly faded. From enslaved Africans, spirituals mapping escape routes to Union anthems masking strike plans in baseball metaphors, the oppressed have always turned stories into smuggled weapons. The medieval world simply refined the art, proving that when words are monitored, metaphor becomes the last free frontier. A ballad about a thorny rose might seem harmless, unless you're the gardener it's really about. A sly fox outwits a greedy wolf. A proud lion hoards treasure while starving ants share their crumbs. On the surface, these medieval animal fables seem like simple children's tales, but peel back the fur and feathers, and you'll find a razor-sharp mirror held up to human society. Take Reynard the Fox, that charismatic trickster who slithered through 12th century European folklore. His adventures weren't just entertainment, they were an encoded social commentary. When Reynard flatters his way out of punishment or plays nobles against each other, medieval peasants recognized their own survival tactics against oppressive lords. The genius. A peasant could laugh at Reynard's antics without risking arrest, while the noble listening beside them might miss the subtext entirely. Consider the hierarchy in these tales: the lion as king, the wolf as corrupt sheriff, the donkey as beleaguered clergyman. This wasn't random casting. It reflected the medieval great chain of being, where every creature had its divinely ordained place. Yet the stories constantly undermined this order. In the Roman, Reynard's triumph over the stronger wolf flipped the natural world's rules, giving hope to the powerless that cleverness could outmatch brute force. These narratives became a psychological pressure valve for societies rigidly stratified by birth, where a farmer could cheer for the underdog fox, outsmarting his betters. Religious tales wielded animal symbolism with equal precision. The Lamb of God imagery offered comfort, but other biblical creatures carried layered meanings. Medieval bestiaries described pelicans piercing their own breasts to feed blood to their young, a graphic metaphor for Christ's sacrifice. Even the lowly snail, often depicted in manuscript margins, symbolized resurrection with its ability to renew its shell. These weren't whimsical decorations. They were theological, embedding complex doctrine in memorable, visual shorthand. Humor provided the perfect Trojan horse for criticism. The Nun's Priest's Tale from Canterbury Tales features a rooster named, whose pompous speeches and eventual fox-induced humiliation satirized both courtly pretension and clerical vanity. A barnyard love triangle between chickens became a sly dig at human foibles, wrapped in feathers so the teller could plead innocence if challenged. Meanwhile, The Ass's Will, where a donkey bequeaths his body parts to various professions, his braying tongue to lawyers, his stubbornness to theologians. Let commoners laugh at those who held power over them. The endurance of these animal allegories reveals their brilliance. Unlike direct protest, which could get you hanged, a fable's meaning shifted with its audience. A lord might hear an amusing yarn about a vain peacock, while his servants recognized their narcissistic landlord. This fluidity made animal stories the perfect vehicle for preserving forbidden knowledge, like Aesop's fables retold by enslaved people, or rabbit tales encoding resistance strategies. When authority figures burned books, they often overlooked children's animal tales, allowing subversive wisdom to survive in plain sight. Today's political cartoons and satirical memes owe much to these medieval precursors. Whether it's Animal Farm or Predator-Prey allegory, we're still using fur and feathers to talk about power, prejudice, and survival. The medieval world grasped a timeless truth. Sometimes the safest way to speak dangerous truths is through the mouth of a fox. A peasant woman kneels in the flickering candlelight of a village chapel, her calloused fingers tracing the painted face of Saint on the wall. She doesn't need a priest to explain the story. She knows it by heart. The dragon swallowing the saint whole, only for her to burst miraculously from its belly, unscathed. To scholars, it's an allegory of resurrection. To her, it's something more visceral, hope that even the devouring jaws of poverty, illness, or childbirth might spit her back into the light. This was the alchemy of medieval religious storytelling. It turned scripture and saintly legends into lived experience, bridging the vast gap between stained glass theology and dirt-streaked daily life. Saints' lives functioned as heaven's reality shows, brimming with relatable drama. Take St. Francis preaching to birds, not just a pretty image, but a radical lesson that holiness wasn't confined to cathedral walls. Or St. Thomas Becket's murder at Canterbury, immortalized in ballads that turned his blood-stained vestments into proof that even kings couldn't crush faith. These weren't dry hagiographies, they were spiritual survival guides. When a mother prayed to Saint, patron saint of toothaches, martyred by having her teeth smashed, she wasn't just seeking divine intervention. She was bonding with a celestial friend who truly understood her pain. Miracle stories performed even heavier lifting, transforming abstract doctrines into tangible help. A drowned child revived by St. Nicholas's intercession didn't just prove God's power, it offered desperate parents a lifeline. The Golden Legend, a medieval bestseller, overflowed with such tales. Blind men regaining sight at martyrs' shrines, storms stilled by a nun's prayers. Skeptics might dismiss them as superstition, but for communities without doctors or insurance, these narratives provided something priceless: agency. Lighting a candle or touching a relic wasn't passive hope, it was actionable faith, a way to participate in their own deliverance. Biblical retellings took similar liberties, adapting ancient texts to contemporary struggles. Mystery plays performed in town squares turned Noah's Ark into slapstick comedy, drunk Noah arguing with his wife, before revealing its deeper message: obedience amid chaos. The Chester Cycle's depiction of the crucifixion had Roman soldiers speaking in local dialects, making Golgotha feel as close as the next village over. This wasn't sacrilege. It was sacred intimacy, collapsing centuries to whisper, "These stories are yours." Even the architecture told stories. Cathedral gargoyles weren't just rain spouts. They were morality plays in stone, with demons snatching greedy merchants, souls and angels weighing souls in balance. A farmer who couldn't read Latin could still read these visual sermons, understanding judgment and grace through grotesques and stained glass. The famous Pauper's Bible used images instead of text, letting the illiterate hear scripture through scenes of David battling Goliath or Jonah spat from the whale, echoes of their own battles against giants of injustice or storms of misfortune. The brilliance of these narratives lay in their elasticity. The Virgin Mary in a Spanish ballad might wear a mantilla and console a heartsick shepherdess, while her Scandinavian counterpart appeared as a stern guarding sailors. These localized Madonnas didn't dilute doctrine. They made it permeable, allowing faith to seep into every crack of cultural identity. Similarly, Jewish communities adapted Exodus into raucous plays where Haman's defeat mirrored their own survival amid persecution. Proof that marginalized groups wielded storytelling as both comfort and resistance. What's often overlooked is how these tales blurred the divine and domestic. A German housewife scattering crumbs for saints' mice wasn't just avoiding pests. She was honoring a saint believed to guide souls to the afterlife, a celestial homemaker tending heaven's pantry. Recipes for Assumption Day, bread, or see butter wove faith into daily chores, turning kneading and churning into tiny sacraments. Faith wasn't compartmentalized into Sundays. It simmered in soup pots and echoed in lullabies. Today's viral chain prayers and celebrity pastor anecdotes aren't so different. We still crave stories that make the cosmic personal. The medieval world simply lacked our pretense of sophistication. They understood that to make faith stick, it couldn't just be believed. It had to be told, in whispers in shouts by street performers, in the silent language of a widow pressing a coin into a saint's worn stone hand. Their stories didn't just explain the divine, they made it reachable, one gritty, glorious tale at a time. A minstrel's next meal depended on the flick of a noble's wrist, a gold coin tossed for a well-placed compliment, or silence for a ballad that missed the mark. This wasn't just entertainment. It was an economy of attention, where stories became currency as tangible as silver. A bard singing in a lord's hall knew his tale of Lancelot's bravery had better flatter the host's lineage, while the same performer in a dockside tavern might swap in raunchy jokes about greedy bishops to keep ale-soaked coins clinking into his cap. The stories that survived weren't necessarily the most artful. They were the ones that paid the rent. Consider the patronage pipeline. Wealthy nobles didn't just hire minstrels for amusement. They invested in reputation management. A duke financing a cycle of songs about his ancestors' crusading heroism was buying social capital, turning family legends into public consensus. Meanwhile, guilds commissioned mystery plays that slyly glorified their trades, bakers portraying saint blessing their ovens, blacksmiths staging Archangel Michael's sword as divinely inspired craftsmanship. Even the church bankrolled passion plays that doubled as recruitment tools, filling coffers while filling pews. The message was clear. Whoever controlled the purse strings steered the narrative. But what happened when the audience was the patron? Street performers and market square storytellers operated on a tip economy, their material honed by trial and error. A ballad about a clever peasant outsmarting a tax collector might earn thunderous applause and generous donations in a poor district, while the same lyrics could get a minstrel whipped out of a merchant's hall. This feedback loop shaped folklore itself. The reason so many medieval tales feature underdogs triumphing over corrupt officials isn't just wish fulfillment, it's market research. People paid for the stories that spoke their grievances aloud. The financial realities left scars on the art form. Manuscript margins reveal scribes grumbling about patrons who paid late or demanded endless revisions. Troubadour poems sometimes included coded pleas for back wages, like Daniel's lament about singing on an empty stomach. Yet constraints bred creativity. When a minstrel's usual patron died or fell from favor, entire story cycles got repurposed. Yesterday's ode to a deposed count might become tomorrow's satire about pride's fall, with only a few strategic word changes. The system's inequalities echo today. Modern creators, from YouTubers to novelists, still bend content toward algorithm-friendly tropes or sponsored demands. What's different is scale. Where a medieval bard might tweak a verse for one lord, today's platforms incentivize global homogenization. Those old minstrels understood something we're relearning. Storytelling never exists in a vacuum. It's a dialogue between survival and sincerity, where every syllable has a price, and every audience gets the stories they're willing to buy. The haunting strains of an Appalachian folk song might seem worlds apart from a medieval castle's great hall, but listen closer. Those same stories of heartbreak, heroism, and hard-won wisdom have been traveling for centuries, carried on the breath of countless singers. Take Barbara, a ballad about love and remorse that crossed the Atlantic with Scottish and Irish immigrants, its roots stretching back to 17th century Britain and likely even earlier. The melody may have shifted, the dialect thickened with mountain twang, but the bones of the tale remain unchanged. A woman's cold rejection, a man's dying grief, and the rose and briar that grow from their graves, entwined in death as they never were in life. This isn't just a song. It's a time capsule, preserving emotional truths that resonated just as powerfully in a medieval village as they do in a modern folk club. The journey of these ballads reveals a hidden map of human migration. The Trois Sisters, a dark tale of jealousy and murder sung from Scandinavia to the American South, mutates with each new shoreline. In Norway, the drowned sister's bones become a fiddle that sings her story. In Appalachia, her hair turns into the strings of a banjo. Each version reflects the instruments and anxieties of its adoptive home, yet the core narrative persists, a testament to how stories adapt without losing their soul. Even the Scarborough Fair, popularized by and descends from an Elizabethan ballad likely rooted in medieval trade fairs. Its refrain of parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme echoing ancient herbal symbolism for love and loss. What's extraordinary is how these songs served as unofficial history books. The Ballad of Sir, chronicling a 13th century Scottish naval disaster, preserved events too painful or politically risky to record openly. Sung in taverns and kitchens, it outlasted official chronicles, proving that melodies could be more durable than parchment. Similarly, the Gypsy Laddie, a tale of a noblewoman eloping with a Romany man, subverted class and racial hierarchies under the guise of romance, offering covert commentary on social boundaries that strict laws couldn't suppress. Themes of resistance and resilience thread through these transplanted ballads. John Henry, the steel-driving man battling a steam drill, mirrors medieval underdog legends like the cobbler's apprentice, where cunning triumphs over brute strength. Both tap into a universal ache, the fear of being replaced, outmatched, or forgotten, whether by industrial machines or feudal oppression. Even protest music owes a debt to medieval precedents. Woody's "This Land Is Your Land" shares DNA with the wandering minstrels' songs that championed common folk against greedy lords. Yet not all survivals are triumphant. Some ballads fossilized prejudices, like The Jew's Daughter, a medieval blood libel tale that mutated into American folk variants, perpetuating harmful stereotypes. Their persistence reminds us that stories aren't inherently noble. They carry the scars and sins of their origins, challenging each generation to confront what deserves to be sung forward. Today's folk revivalists, from To The, aren't just reviving old tunes. They're stepping into a river that's been flowing since the first minstrel strummed a lute. When Sing's Pretty, a mournful Appalachian air likely born from an Irish mother's lament, she's not covering a song. She's tending a flame passed hand to hand across oceans and eras. The medieval world understood that stories outlive empires, and their ballads, now nestled in guitar cases and playlists, still whisper the same truth. The human heart hasn't changed its tune. The stories and ballads of medieval Europe weren't just ways to pass the time. They were the heartbeat of a world without newspapers, schools, or social media. Every tale told by firelight, every ballad sung in the marketplace, carried layers of meaning that shaped how people understood their lives. These narratives were survival tools, legal records, protest anthems, and moral compasses all at once. When a mother sang her child a lullaby about the dangers of wolves, she wasn't just entertaining. She was encoding generations of hard-earned wisdom into a melody her child would never forget. What's astonishing is how these ancient storytelling techniques still pulse through our modern world. Think about the last time you scrolled through social media. Those viral stories, memes, and even protest slogans operate much like medieval ballads. They simplify complex ideas, spread faster than facts, and often carry hidden layers of meaning. A catchy protest chant today isn't so different from a rebellious Robin Hood ballad whispered in a tavern. The platforms have changed, but the human instinct to frame our struggles and joys through story remains unshaken. The medieval world also understood something we sometimes forget. Stories are never neutral. They can uphold power, like the chivalric romances that glorified knights and lords, or undermine it, like the where clever peasants outsmarted greedy kings. The same story could be a comfort or a weapon, depending on who told it and why. That duality still exists. Today's blockbuster movies, political speeches, and even news headlines are the heirs to those medieval traditions, shaping how we see justice, heroism, and belonging. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is how stories build bridges across time. When a modern fantasy author like George R.R. Martin borrows from the War of the Roses, or a songwriter nods to an ancient murder ballad, they're stepping into a river of narrative that's been flowing for centuries. The themes that gripped medieval listeners, love, betrayal, the struggle against injustice, still resonate because they tap into universal human experiences. The costumes and settings may shift, but the heart of the story stays the same. So the next time you lose yourself in a book, movie, or song, remember, you're part of a tradition as old as firelight and shared silence. Those medieval voices still have something to say to us if we're willing to listen. And if you've enjoyed this journey through the stories of the past, why not join the conversation? Share your favorite medieval tale or modern story with echoes of the past in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners. The story continues, and you're now part